Elias Ward, a former Navy SEAL turned undercover CIA operative, walked into a small-town courtroom accused of attacking a police officer, a crime he didn't commit. But Elias wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to expose a racist judge and the corrupt system hiding behind the bench. As Judge Lawton shouted him down, unaware of who he was really dealing with, one question echoed. What happens when the man they tried to silence is the one sent to bring them down? If this story grips you already, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and share it with someone who believes in justice, because what happens next might just surprise you. It was just past 8:00 a.m. when Elias Ward parked his car across from the old police substation on Larkin Avenue. The town of Millstone hadn't changed much in the last 20 years. Still quiet, still careful about who it let feel comfortable. But Elias wasn't there for comfort. He was watching. He'd been tracking a pattern in patrol rotations for weeks, following money trails, studying behavior. On paper, he was no one. In truth, he was a former Navy SEAL now working under deep cover for an agency that didn't print its name on badges. The officer he'd come to observe stepped out of the diner 2 doors down. Elias clocked the movement, logged the timing, the hand gesture to the guy across the street. Subtle. Too subtle for a normal morning. He felt it before he saw it. The shift in tension, the smell of a setup coming too clean, too rehearsed. Then came the cruiser. No lights, no sirens, just intent. 2 white officers stepped out, one moving to block the rear of Elias's vehicle, the other marching straight to the window like he owned the day. Elias rolled the window halfway, hands calmly resting on the wheel. The officer didn't greet him, didn't ask a question. Just barked license. Now. Elias kept his voice low, steady. You don't want to do this. That should have given them pause. It didn't. The rear door flung open. Elias was yanked out and slammed onto the hood before either of them had said the word arrest. Then came the shout, officer down, before anyone was even on the ground. The cuffs clicked shut like punctuation. No struggle, no resistance. Just force followed by lies. From across the street, Miss Esther clutched her grocery bag tighter. She had lived through 6 decades of that sound, black skin hitting concrete and white uniforms shouting danger. It wasn't new, but this time it felt different. Just up the sidewalk, Maya Monroe, a young journalist from Atlanta, stopped mid-step. She had her phone out before she even realized it, filming the moment, as instinct more than intention. The man being arrested hadn't fought back. He hadn't moved. But there was something in the way he looked at those officers, like he already knew exactly how far they'd go and was letting them go there. They charged him with assaulting an officer, said he'd resisted arrest. But Maya's footage showed none of that. Not a raised hand, not a single word after that first calm warning. And yet they dragged him off like he was a threat. Back at the station, things didn't quite line up. No priors, no warrants. The name Elias Ward triggered a few questions in the system, but not answers. His file was sealed tighter than most military records, the kind of sealed that makes people nervous to ask more. But they booked him anyway, tossed him into holding, called it procedure. Elias said nothing, not a word, just sat on the bench, hands relaxed, eyes sharp, back straight, like a man who'd never bowed to anyone. Jason Hale, a young corrections officer, watched him from behind the glass and later whispered to a colleague, "That guy's not afraid. That guy's just waiting." And he was, not because he didn't care, but because he already knew this was step 1. He wasn't caught off guard. He wasn't overpowered. Elias Ward let them take him in, because the only way to bring down a system from the outside is to step inside and let it show its rot. And right now, the rot was sitting in a courtroom across the street wearing a black robe and calling itself justice. What Elias had just walked into wasn't a mistake. It was a mission. And Judge Gregory Lawton had no idea that the man he was about to humiliate in court had come to destroy everything he stood on. Let's step into that courtroom. It's time we heard what silence can do. They brought Elias into the courtroom in cuffs. Not because it was necessary, but because it was a message. The room shifted when he entered, not with noise, but with tension. The kind that crawled up your spine and made you forget to blink. His presence wasn't loud, but it swallowed the air. A man dressed plainly, chained, deliberately, and yet somehow, he looked like the one in control. Judge Gregory Lawton sat high on his bench, fingers tapping rhythmically, like he was already annoyed by the very idea of being made to listen. "Mr. Ward," he said, voice cutting through the silence like cold steel. "I'll only ask once. Do you have counsel? Or are you planning to represent yourself like some kind of hero?" Samantha Doyle, the court-appointed public defender, stood. She looked rushed, unprepared, but not unkind. "Your Honor, I've been assigned to Mr. Ward's case. We've spoken briefly." Lawton cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Briefly? Does your client understand the severity of the charges? Assaulting a peace officer is not a parking ticket." Elias said nothing. Samantha turned to him. Her voice was a whisper, now tense. "Elias, this is your chance. If you plead not guilty now, I can try to—" "I'm not pleading guilty," he said calmly, eyes fixed on the judge. "Not today. Not ever." Lawton's eyebrows lifted. "Ah, so he speaks." There was a laugh. Not from the gallery, not from the press row. It came from Lawton himself. Short, sharp, mocking. "Well then," he said, leaning forward. "Tell us, Mr. Ward, what exactly were you doing, loitering outside a police station with surveillance gear in your car?" Samantha stiffened. "Objection. Your Honor, that question assumes facts not yet." "Sustained," Lawton muttered. "For now." He turned back to Elias. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" His voice changed tone, cooler, smugger. "A Navy SEAL, according to these sealed documents. Imagine that. A hero, now a thug in cuffs." Elias didn't flinch. "Why aren't you defending yourself?" Lawton pressed. "Cat got your tongue? Or is this the part where the martyr act begins?" Still nothing. Just Elias standing there, jaw-locked, gaze steady. His silence saying more than words ever could. From the gallery, Maya Monroe scribbled something down but couldn't stop staring. She leaned toward Miss Esther, whispering, "Why isn't he saying anything? Doesn't he want to defend himself?" Esther didn't take her eyes off Elias. Her answer came soft but sharp. "That ain't silence, baby. That's strategy." Back at the bench, Lawton wasn't done. "You're not special, Mr. Ward. You don't intimidate this courtroom with your silence. You're just another angry man hoping the uniform buys you sympathy." Elias finally moved. Just a tilt of his head. Just enough to make eye contact. And then one sentence, low, firm, final. "You think this is about sympathy?" The courtroom froze. Lawton leaned back, but his face cracked for half a second. Just a flicker of unease. Samantha blinked. Maya stopped writing. Esther nodded once slowly. And Lawton, desperate to reclaim ground, snapped bail is denied. Hearing set for Friday. Court is adjourned. His gavel hit the wood harder than necessary. It wasn't a ruling. It was retreat. The guards led Elias out, but he didn't look down. Didn't look back. He walked like a man with a purpose that no cell could interrupt. Maya leaned forward, breath caught in her throat. "He's not just fighting this," she whispered. "He came to win it." And from behind her, Miss Esther added, "No, child. He came to end it." What the courtroom didn't know, what Lawton was about to learn too late, was that Elias Ward wasn't just a defendant. He was the beginning of the end. The second day in court started without ceremony, but you could feel it brewing the moment Elias walked in. No cuffs this time. Just two guards flanking him like he was still a threat they couldn't explain. Judge Lawton was already seated, his gavel untouched, fingers pressed together like he'd been waiting all morning for this. His jaw clenched, his eyes sharp. There was something about Elias's silence the day before that had rattled him, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was unreadable. "Bring the defendant forward," Lawton said without looking up. Elias stepped into position, calm as ever. Shoulders square, chin steady. "Mr. Ward Lawton," began louder this time. "You seem to think your silence makes you mysterious. Let me be clear, it doesn't. It makes you look guilty. No reaction. You want to act tough. Fine, but in this courtroom you're nothing. Not a soldier, not a patriot. Just another name on a docket standing where hundreds have stood before you. And just like them, you'll leave here stripped of whatever delusion you're clinging to. Still nothing." Elias didn't blink. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe louder. The silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was pressing into the judge's words, folding around them, turning them hollow. Lawton's lips curled. "You think you're untouchable," he barked, rising slightly from his chair. "You're just another black thug in uniform. You wear honor like it gives you immunity. But it doesn't. Not here. Not with me. The room stiffened. Even the bailiff shifted his weight, uncertain now. Samantha Doyle looked away. Maya Monroe froze mid-note. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He simply raised his eyes and met Lawton's. That look did something to the room. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was control. It was the kind of look that says, I know who you are. I know what you're hiding. And I'm not afraid to face it. For a second, just 1 second, you could see the blood leave Lawton's face. He straightened, cleared his throat, then sat back too quickly, fumbling with the papers in front of him like they might shield him from the weight of the moment. The courtroom didn't breathe. Then, quietly from this back corner near the jury box, a young corrections officer named Jason Hale leaned forward, squinting at Elias's posture, the way he held his hands, the slight tilt of his stance. Jason had been Navy Reserve before joining the court system, and what he saw, it clicked. That wasn't just a veteran. That was someone trained for something deeper. His eyes fell to the inside of Elias's wrist where a barely visible scar arched under the skin, clean, curved surgical. He'd seen that before. Not in court. In training. SEAL. Jason sat back slowly, suddenly unsure of everything he thought he knew about this man. In the gallery, Maya Monroe had been watching the tension, but something about Lawton's outburst unsettled her. Judges got impatient, sure. But that wasn't law talking. That was something else, personal, furious, unstable. She pulled out her tablet, clicked into the federal records search, and typed Elias Ward. Nothing. She tried the state military database. Nothing. Then she looked harder. Backdoor search filters. Journalists had their tricks. And when she tried cross-referencing his name with a list of classified deployments, she got a lockout message. Access denied. Intelligence clearance required. Maya sat still, her mind raced. Who the hell was this man? And why did a Georgia courtroom have him on trial when the federal system had buried his file in a vault? Up front, Judge Lawton was still speaking, but no one was really listening. His voice had lost its fire. His words were wandering now, circling around legal jargon to fill the space where his confidence used to be. Because no matter what he said, Elias Ward had already taken control of the room, without raising his voice, without taking a step, without saying another word. And that silence, it was louder than the gavel, louder than the slur, louder than the hate. It was the beginning of Lawton's unraveling, because you can scream at a man all you want, but when he doesn't scream back, that's when the real danger begins. The holding cell was dim and too quiet, the kind of quiet that made a man think too much. Jason Hale stood just outside the bars pretending to review paperwork, but his eyes kept drifting back to Elias. Elias sat on the bench with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands folded, the same way someone might sit in a church pew, still deliberate waiting. His gaze didn't wander. It didn't need to. Jason finally spoke, voice barely more than a breath. You one of them? Elias didn't look up. A pause, then a barely visible nod. No confirmation, no smile. Just a man acknowledging something he never planned to explain. Jason looked away quickly. His chest tightened like the air in the room had gotten thicker. He didn't press further. He didn't need to. That nod told him enough. Later that night, while the courtroom lights sat dark and forgotten, Maya Monroe sat hunched over her laptop in a diner booth across town, coffee gone cold beside her. Her screen glowed with half a dozen windows open, military archives, declassified photos, and one specific image she'd found in an old Department of Defense newsletter from nearly a decade ago. It was grainy, taken at night under floodlights. 5 Navy SEALs covered in dirt and blood stood in front of a broken prison wall. 4 of them had names and ranks listed beneath. The 5th, taller, darker-skinned, standing slightly behind the others, had no caption at all. She zoomed in. It was him. Same posture, same eyes, same silence. Whoever he was. They had gone to great lengths to erase him from the story. And yet here he was again in a courthouse in Georgia, refusing to be seen on anyone else's terms. Back inside his cell, Elias pulled a small black notebook from beneath his waistband. No one had checked it. No one ever did. They thought the danger lived in the body, not the mind. He opened it to a blank page and began to write slow and steady. Silence is not surrender. It's timing. He paused, then underlined the words. His hand lingered over the page, because silence was what had saved his team that night in Syria. When they'd been trapped behind enemy lines, when the rescue window had collapsed, and when 4 of his men had been ready to fight and die on instinct, Elias had held up one finger. Wait. They had waited, and because they waited, they had lived. But he hadn't walked out unscarred. He had stayed behind when the others escaped, given up his rifle, lifted his hands. He'd made sure they got to the chopper even if it meant the doors closed on him. What came next wasn't heroism. It wasn't glory. It was pain. Brutal. Unrelenting. Torture meant to break the body and erase the soul. But Elias had stayed silent then, too. Not because he had no name, but because the mission was bigger than him. And some things are louder when left unsaid. 3 days in captivity, no food, no light, no answers. When the second team came back for him, they found him barely breathing, but whole. And that silence, the kind that had saved him then, was the same silence he carried now. Because this courtroom wasn't just about a false charge. It wasn't about the bruises on his wrists or the slurs hurled across the bench. It was about timing. It was about watching corruption long enough to know where it sleeps and waiting for the exact moment to strike. Now wasn't that moment, but it was getting close. From outside the bars, Jason looked back one more time before turning in for the night. He didn't speak, and Elias didn't move, but something passed between them, an understanding, a shift. Some silences scream louder than words, and Elias Ward was done whispering. There's a difference between a man who applies the law and a man who hides behind it. Most folks don't notice that line until someone like Judge Gregory Lawton walks right over it, then keeps on going. On paper, Lawton was clean, decorated, appointed, re-elected 3 times in a conservative district where the gavel spoke louder than the people. But paper doesn't hold grief. And grief, when left to rot, turns into something else. Years ago, before the gray streaked his temples and before the arrogance grew into armor, Lawton had a son, Andrew, 23. Fresh out of college, mouthy but decent, trying to find himself like most young men do. One night a bar fight turned into something else. No cameras, no warning, just fists, then gunshots, then sirens. By the time Lawton arrived at the ER, Andrew was already under a sheet. The man who pulled the trigger had served 2 tours in Iraq, a black Marine with a history of PTSD and a license for concealed carry. He claimed self-defense. He walked on a technicality. And that was the moment something inside Lawton broke. He never said it aloud, never wrote it down, but people close to him noticed the shift. He started calling certain defendants aggressive before the trial even started. If they were black and wore a uniform, he looked at them twice. If they raised their voice in court, he raised bail. If they had service records, he questioned their mental state. It wasn't law anymore. It was vengeance. Dressed in robes, hidden behind the seal of the court. Over time, Lawton found allies. Not politicians, not clerks. Men like Sheriff Ray Daniels, a small-town cop with a big ego and even bigger secrets. Daniels had been in office longer than most people in the county had been alive. He knew where the bodies were buried mostly because he'd helped dig the holes. It was Daniels who brought Lawton cases that couldn't stand on their own. Arrests based on shaky testimony. Evidence that magically appeared. Body cam footage that never made it to the record. And Lawton. He made them stick. Stamped guilt like it was gospel, all while looking defenders in the eye and daring them to speak up. Together they crafted a quiet kind of terror, one that wore a badge, signed documents, and smiled in photographs. But not everyone was blind. Maya Monroe had been digging for days now, each file leading to another sealed record, another inconclusive ruling. It was like peeling wallpaper in a room full of rot. 7 cases stood out, different names, different dates, but the same pattern: black male veteran. Alleged aggression. Lawton on the bench. Daniels on the arrest report. No conviction ever overturned. She rubbed her eyes, then leaned in closer to the screen. One of the cases was labeled confidential, flagged by internal affairs, then mysteriously dropped before it reached federal review. The defendant had filed a complaint before disappearing literally. No address, no phone, gone. She stared at the judge's photo in the article, Lawton shaking hands with Daniels outside a courthouse fundraiser. Both men laughing like they'd just won something. Maya knew this wasn't just corruption. It was personal. Back in the courthouse, Lawton reviewed Elias's file again. Not because he needed to, He already knew the outcome he wanted. But something about Elias's silence was different. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't fear. It wasn't arrogance. It was patience. That more than anything made Lawton uneasy, because patience in the hands of the wrong man could mean strategy, and strategy in a courtroom like his was dangerous. He glanced toward Daniels, who stood by the hallway door like a sentinel. No nod was exchanged. No words spoken. They didn't need to. The plan was already in motion. Elias Ward wouldn't walk free, not if they had to rewrite the entire docket to stop him. But what neither man realized was that someone had already started rewriting the story. Maya closed her laptop and stood. Because secrets have roots, yes, but they also leave trails. And the truth was waking up. The days in court became a rhythm. Same faces, same glares, same silences. But beneath that still surface, something was shifting. You could feel it like pressure in the air before a storm. Elias hadn't said much. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer just resistance, it was planning. What most didn't know was that somewhere across the Potomac in a high-security office inside Langley, the name Elias Ward had just reappeared on a classified monitor. "Sir," the analyst whispered, stepping closer to the director's desk. "We have movement." Ward made contact inside the Georgia courthouse. Indirect, but intentional. The CIA director didn't look up. He just nodded once, then reached for the folder marked Operation Lighthold. "Is he compromised?" "No, sir, but he's accelerating." That gave the director pause. "Elias Ward doesn't accelerate unless something's gone wrong," or the analyst said quietly, "unless he's about to finish." The director finally closed the file and stood. "He's not cleared to break cover. Not yet. We're not ready to pull the whole chain." "Sir, he's already pulling it." Back in the small-town courtroom, Maya Monroe's world had started to tilt. It began with a call that cut off mid-ring. Then her apartment lock scratched reset off by just enough to notice. The next morning, her laptop had been moved 2 inches to the left on her kitchen table. She hadn't left it that way. She thought she was just being paranoid until the message came through. No name, no number, just 6 words. "Stop digging, or disappear like them." Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. Not when she called the editor, not when she forwarded the threat, and definitely not when she dug deeper that very night. She wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Jason Hale had kept his head down since that quiet exchange with Elias, but something in him kept circling back to that sealed list of inmates, men who'd passed through this very courthouse, sentenced under Judge Lawton, all with the same strange irregularities. A few had since died in prison. A couple had vanished from the system entirely. And every file, stamped with Lawton's signature. Jason printed 1 copy. Just one. Folded it twice. Slid it through the slot of Elias's cell when no one was looking. Not a word was exchanged. But when Elias opened it, you could almost hear the final lock click into place. He was no longer waiting. That night, he asked to see Officer Grady, the older corrections guard who'd been working the night shift for over a decade. The kind who never asked too many questions but always listened when it mattered. They met in the empty medical room. Elias stood near the sink, his hands folded calm. Grady crossed his arms. "You don't talk," Grady said, "but you listen too well." "I need 5 minutes," Elias replied, eyes meeting his. "Off the record." Grady raised an eyebrow. "You recording this?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just waited. 5 minutes passed. And in that time, Grady vented about the bribes, about the pressure from Lawton, about the cases he'd watched crumble under silence and fear. He didn't confess to a crime, but he painted the map. That was all Elias needed. The wire beneath his collar picked up everything. Later that night, back in his cell, Elias opened his notebook again. He didn't write much, just 1 line underlined twice. This isn't survival. This is justice. Because this wasn't just about clearing his name. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about stopping something bigger than him, something that had poisoned the very place where truth was supposed to live. And now the poison had a face. The courtroom still wore its mask, but behind it the storm had already started. And this time, silence wouldn't be the weapon. It would be the trap. By the time the morning sun broke across Millstone, something in the air had changed. It wasn't visible, not to most people walking the sidewalks or pouring coffee behind diner counters. But inside that courthouse, inside the cracks of the system, pressure was building. Quietly, strategically. like a fuse running just beneath the surface. At Langley, a red light blinked quietly on a secure server inside the operations wing. A name had been flagged again: Elias Ward. The director of clandestine operations tapped his knuckles against the steel desk and narrowed his eyes. "He's still dark," he muttered. "We didn't authorize exposure." His aide leaned in. "Then why's he in court?" The director didn't answer at first. He simply looked at the screen, then whispered almost to himself, "Because he's not just watching anymore. He's moving." In Millstone, Maya Monroe's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, articles, files, and sealed reports all spread out like puzzle pieces on her motel room bed. She had enough to prove a pattern, enough to make noise. But just as she hit the key to upload her findings to the cloud, the lights in her room flickered once, then died. Silence. She froze. From outside the door came a soft click. Not a knock. Not footsteps. Just a click. She reached for her phone, but the screen was dead. Then came the text. No name, no number, just 5 words. "Stop digging or disappear by morning." Her chest tightened, but her hand didn't shake. She took a breath, picked up her camera, and pressed record. "If anything happens to me," she said into the lens, "look at Judge Lawton, look at Sheriff Daniels, and find Elias Ward." Back in holding, Jason Hale waited for the hallway to clear before sliding a folded paper under the bench where Elias sat. Elias glanced down, then slowly unfolded the sheet. 12 names, 12 case numbers. Every one of them stamped with Judge Lawton's signature, each defendant either a veteran or a black man who'd claimed excessive force. Jason spoke without turning around. "I cross-checked those with Daniel's arrest logs. 8 of them never made it to prison. 4 were transferred out of county and never heard from again." Elias didn't speak, but something in his jaw tightened. Jason turned his head just enough to add, "They called it procedural reassignment. But there's no trail, no release, no record of transfer." Elias folded the paper again, slid it into the lining of his shoe, and whispered, "That's all I needed." Later that night in the break room, where no cameras watched and no microphones were supposed to exist, Elias leaned forward toward one of the guards who always talked too much. "You ever wonder," Elias said casually, "why the judge always knows which cases to push through fastest?" The guard smirked, not realizing his words were being captured by the tiny device inside Elias's coat button. "Because it's all pre-arranged. The sheriff brings him in. Lawton signs. Money changes hands. That's how Millstone works." Elias nodded like he didn't care. But in his notebook, beneath the words already etched in black ink, he wrote one more line. "This isn't survival. This is justice." And in that moment, something shifted. He was no longer playing defense. He was setting the trap. Out in the hallway, Maya returned to the courthouse, bruised from fear, but sharper than ever. She passed Jason in the stairwell, whispered just one word. "They know." Jason didn't need more. He only asked, "Are you still in?" Maya stared toward the courtroom doors, then said quietly, "They should have never let me see what I've seen." At Langley, the CIA director made the call. "Green light containment," he said. "If Elias flips this publicly, we clean up after." His aide paused. "Should we pull him out?" "No," the director said. "He's deeper in than we are, and he knows exactly what he's doing. Because this wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a battlefield. And Elias Ward had just taken the first shot. By the time the courthouse opened that morning, the air outside already felt charged. Not from the weather, not from traffic, but from them. Reporters. Veterans in uniform. Mothers holding signs with names of sons the system forgot. People who didn't know Elias Ward yesterday now stood shoulder to shoulder because of one thing Maya Monroe had written. The soldier who chose silence. She posted it at 3:07 a.m. By 6:15 it had nearly 500,000 views, and by 7 Hosro it had become something else entirely, a call. A retired Air Force captain flew in from South Carolina just to hand-deliver a letter to the courthouse clerk demanding a review of his brother's case. A congresswoman issued a statement within the hour. Civil rights attorneys from Atlanta arrived with clipboards, cameras, and press credentials asking for records that had been sealed for years. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Gregory Lawton sat down with a stiffness that didn't come from age. It came from knowing deep down that the walls weren't just cracking, they were shifting. He watched Maya from the bench, his eyes following her like a hawk watching a storm form over its own nest. She sat quietly in the third pew, her notebook closed in her lap, but everyone knew she was still writing. And Lawton leaned forward. "Keep writing. he said, voice low but carrying. I'll write your ending. Maya didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head and whispered back, not loud enough for the recorder, but loud enough for him. Then spell my name right. The gallery caught its breath. Across the aisle, Jason Hale leaned against the wall near the bailiff's station, pretending not to hear. But his knuckles were white. Lawton turned back toward the front. The bailiff called the case, State of Georgia versus Elias Ward. And then from the hallway came the sound of slow, deliberate steps. No chains, no cuffs, just the sound of boots, military boots, walking across the polished floor. Elias Ward entered the room not like a prisoner, but like a man who had come to finish something. His shoulders squared, his eyes steady, the same uniform he had worn the day he was arrested pressed clean, as if someone had returned it to him with care. As he passed Maya, she caught the faintest glimpse of something at his chest pocket. A card. It wasn't a driver's license. And it wasn't for show. It was small, government-issued, dark blue edging. Jason saw it too. And for the first time since this all began, he smiled. Lawton watched Elias approach the defense table, still silent, still unreadable, but something in his gut shifted, something small but sharp, because silence wasn't working for Lawton anymore. It was working against him. Outside protesters chanted names that hadn't been said in public in years, and cameras turned waiting. The country was watching now. The gavel no longer belonged to one man, and as Elias took his seat, placing his hands calmly on the table before him, Maya flipped open her notebook and wrote 4 words. He brought the truth, and the next sound that filled that courtroom was not a command, not an objection. It was the sound of old power beginning to tremble. For 7 days he had said nothing, not a protest, not a plea, just silence, measured, controlled, like a soldier waiting for the exact second before pulling the pin. And this was that second. The courtroom had been packed since dawn, reporters spilling into the hallway, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with activists, cameras perched like vultures ready to catch blood. But what they got instead was clarity, delivered not in a whisper, but with the force of a man who had earned the right to speak. Elias stood. His hands didn't shake. He looked directly at Judge Lawton, no blink, no hesitation. Then came the voice, deep, grounded, like it came from a place most men never survive. I bled for this country while you buried people under paper. The room stilled. Maya's livestream hit 1 million views before she could even lift her phone higher. Jason froze where he stood, not in fear, but in reverence. And Lawton, well, Lawton didn't breathe. Elias reached into his jacket pocket. There was a collective inhale, that sharp courtroom gasp that only comes when the script is about to be rewritten. He pulled out a card. Small, blue, official. He held it up high. Elias Ward, Intelligence Directorate. Active clearance. The silence broke like glass. The gallery erupted. Phones flew up. Livestream counters spiked past 3 million in minutes. Someone gasped. Someone else cried. But all eyes returned to Elias because he hadn't finished. This court thought I was just another angry black man who couldn't keep quiet. That's what you saw. A statistic. A threat. Something to control. He took a step forward. But I've worn the uniform you disrespect. I've buried brothers whose names never made the news. I've rescued Americans you didn't even know were missing. And while you sat behind that bench pretending to serve justice, I served this country with blood, silence, and scars you'll never understand. Lawton finally found his voice. You're out of order. Elias didn't flinch. No, you've been out of order for years. He turned slowly to face the room. This isn't justice. This is theater. And you, he pointed back at the bench, voice sharper now, you're the villain. Lawton slammed his gavel hard 3 times. Bailiff, remove. Jason Hale took a step forward from the gallery. No, sir, not today. The gavel stopped mid-air. Jason's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Protocol states, when a federal agent identifies in court, the proceedings halt for clearance confirmation. He walked toward Elias, then stood beside him. I verified his badge, his name, his mission. Lawton's face drained of color. You don't have authority. I have more than you think, Jason said. Then added, and so does he. Maya's live stream surged past 5 million. The comment section exploded. People watching from hospital beds, from classrooms, from barbershops and bus stops, all frozen by the sight of one man choosing to stand in a room built to break him. And he wasn't done yet. I kept silent. Elias said, eyes sweeping across the faces, now hanging on his every word, because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought no one was watching. And what I saw was a man so eaten by hate, he used the law to finish what grief started. Then, turning to the jury, to the press, to the people, you all came here for justice, but maybe what we need first is truth, and this is mine. The courtroom didn't cheer. Not yet. Because this wasn't over. But in that moment, just for a heartbeat, the room stood still. And for the first time since this all began, Lawton looked afraid. At exactly 10:14 a.m., just as Judge Gregory Lawton adjusted his robe and leaned forward to reclaim control, the double doors of the courtroom burst open. Not violently, but with the kind of calm finality that makes a man freeze before he even knows why. The first agent stepped in, followed by 5 others. Not a single badge flashed. They didn't need to. Every suit was federal black, every face was blank, and every step was exact. One agent walked toward the bench, the rest fanned out toward the gallery. The crowd sensed it. This was no ordinary day in court. And then the lead agent, standing beside the defense table, opened a thin leather folder and spoke in a voice that cut through everything. Gregory Lawton, Walter Daniels, Helen Gage, Deputy Moore, by federal order. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress evidence, and civil rights violations. The courtroom didn't gasp. It froze. Lawton gripped the edge of the bench like it could hold back the tide. His lips parted, but no words came. The color in his face drained so fast it looked like time itself had punched him in the chest. Elias Ward didn't move. He simply stepped to the side, extended his arm, and handed over a sealed envelope and a flash drive to the agent. The agent gave a nod. This the full evidence set. Elias's voice was even grounded. Chain of custody is intact. Timestamps, GPS logs, audio from 2 years' worth of holding cell conversations. He paused. And this? From his other pocket, Elias pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a prisoner list. 17 names, every one of them black. Every one of them convicted under Judge Lawton. And next to each name, Jason Hale's signature. The young correctional officer stepped forward from the back of the room. His voice didn't shake. I witnessed case manipulation. I logged every file. And I watched men be destroyed because they didn't look like the judge's son. Maya's livestream exploded past 6 million viewers. In her lens, the entire nation watched Gregory Lawton's legacy unravel in real time. You're making a mistake. Lawton finally snapped, eyes wide. I built this courtroom. The lead agent didn't blink. And you ran it like a weapon. Still, Lawton wouldn't stop. You have no idea what kind of people I've kept off the streets. I protected this town. Elias stepped forward. His eyes for once didn't hold silence. They held judgment. And you buried men alive for the crime of not being you. The agent signaled the cuff team. And that was the moment. Lawton rose too quickly, tried to step around the bench, but was caught mid-move by a second agent. His hands were yanked behind him with military precision, the cuffs locked tight. His robe shifted awkwardly, half falling from his shoulder like the dignity he'd clung to for years. The gallery stood, not in applause, in stunned silence. Even the jurors stood. Elias didn't flinch. Maya raised her phone, catching the precise instant Lawton screamed. You're ruining everything I worked for. And Elias, calm as ever, finally spoke to the room, not just to Lawton, but to the very institution around them. You ruined it yourself the day you thought your pain gave you permission to become a god. Outside, reporters flooded the steps. Inside, Daniels was escorted out next, head down, face pale. Gage followed, still cursing. Moore was last caught by agents in the hallway trying to slip out through a side door with his badge hidden in his shoe. But it didn't matter. Every badge in that courthouse now belonged to someone else. Justice had changed hands, and the man who once stood alone in chains now stood surrounded by a nation finally listening. Elias said nothing more, because the truth didn't need repeating. It was already louder than anything Lawton could scream. When the final gavel struck, it didn't echo like a bang. It landed soft, steady, like the exhale of something that had been holding its breath far too long. People poured out of the courtroom like a tide, but Elias Ward didn't follow them. He waited until the cameras turned, until the gallery thinned, until Judge Lawton's voice had disappeared behind steel doors and memories. Only then did Elias rise. He said nothing to the reporters gathered outside. He passed by microphones and flash bulbs like they weren't even there. Some shouted his name. Others called him the CIA guy, the Navy SEAL, the hero who broke the system. But Elias didn't answer any of it. He just walked. His footsteps weren't loud, weren't proud. They were measured, like the boots of a man who'd already walked through worse and never once asked the world to clap. Maya stood across the street, a microphone still in her hand, but her voice already failing. Tears didn't fall, but they lived behind her eyes. She had just gotten off a call. Her editor. Her name was trending on national news. But what made her voice catch wasn't any of that. It was the fact that Elias had known about her father. Known that Charles Monroe had once stood in that same courtroom, accused, humiliated, crushed by Judge Lawton. And still Elias had never said a word. Never made it about vengeance, only about the truth. Later that night, Maya's piece would be picked up by the Times. She would be invited to speak at Georgetown. Her story would open an investigation into 17 more judges statewide. But in that moment, all she could hear was the voice of Miss Esther behind her. That boy didn't win loud, she said almost to herself. He won true. On the courthouse steps, a young black boy in a faded hoodie clutched his mother's hand and looked up at Elias as he passed. He stared hard, like trying to memorize a face history had just tried to erase. "Hey, mister," he asked, wide-eyed. "You were the one who beat the judge." Elias paused. He looked down. The lines around his eyes softened just slightly. And with a quiet smile, he bent at the knee not to lower himself, but to meet the boy at eye level. "No," he said gently, "I just didn't bow." Then he stood, turned, and disappeared down the sidewalk. Not with music, not with applause, just with presence. And long after the news vans left, after the lights went cold, and the air settled again around that old courthouse, his silence remained. A silence that wasn't weakness. It was choice. And that more than anything he said or didn't say was what they remembered. Some battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. They're fought with silence, conviction, and the strength to stand when the world demands you kneel. Elias Ward didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply refused to bow, and that quiet resistance spoke louder than any courtroom outburst ever could. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, think, or feel something deeper, we invite you to give this video a like. Share it with someone who believes in justice, dignity, and the power of holding the line. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen fades, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Your support means everything to us. It fuels the passion behind every word, every twist, every truth we dare to tell. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember the ones the world tried to forget.